It had been years since I last felt watched. Not observed out of duty or politeness, not glanced at like a familiar painting hung in the same spot for 2 decades, but truly watched, like a flame being studied for the heat it gives off. Not the light. He arrived with a backpack that looked too small for the months he was supposed to stay. Taller than I remembered, broader too. He greeted us politely with that careful voice people use when they're not sure where they belong. My husband embraced him with a pride I rarely saw directed at me, and I smiled because that's what was expected. The first day was quiet. He helped carry boxes to the shed, unpacked his things in the guest room, and asked if there was a specific shelf he could use in the fridge. Everything about him was considerate, measured, but later that evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing a bowl, I felt his eyes on my back, not lingering, not indecent, but full of something that made the space behind me feel warmer. I turned and he looked away almost instantly, grabbing a towel to dry his hands, but I saw it. Not teenage awkwardness, not curiosity. Something else. Something unnervingly adult. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of guilt or fear I had done nothing wrong, but something in me refused to quiet down. My body, so used to stillness, kept shifting under the sheets, searching for a position that didn't exist. Beside me, my husband slept heavily, his breath slow and steady. We hadn't touched in days. Weeks, maybe I'd stopped counting. It wasn't resentment. He hadn't changed. He still made me tea on Sundays, still asked about the garden, still complimented my roast chicken. But something had dulled, or maybe it had never sharpened in the first place. In the morning I chose a dress I hadn't worn since last summer. Not short, not revealing but light, almost translucent in sunlight. The fabric slid over my skin like a forgotten memory. I added earrings I hadn't touched in months. No one commented. Breakfast passed like any other toast eggs. A brief discussion of weather and plans for the weekend. He didn't look at me once, or perhaps he looked precisely once when I reached across the table to pour more tea. I caught his eyes. The silence around it was deafening. Later that day, I walked past the guest room. The door was ajar, just enough to see him sitting on the bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up. Our eyes met for longer than necessary. He didn't smile, neither did I. And yet something in the air between us curled taut like the thread of a spider web, waiting to snap. I went into the bathroom, closed the door, opened the drawer, where I kept the nicer things, lace silk, a matching set I had bought years ago and worn maybe twice. I held it in my hands. Pale blue. I remembered how it had felt under summer dresses, how it had made me feel seen, desired. I changed without ceremony. No perfume, no lipstick, just the quiet sound of fabric brushing skin. I looked at myself in the mirror, same face, same lines near the mouth, but the eyes. There was something new, or very old. The rest of the day passed unremarkably. My husband watched the news. I made soup. The boy, he sat on the porch for a while, reading. Once when I came out to water the flowers, he moved slightly to the side to make room on the bench. I didn't sit. I watered the petunias, aware of his stillness, of how deliberately he avoided looking up. At night again, I couldn't sleep. I listened to the floor creak lightly, the wind outside, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I didn't get up. I didn't move closer to him. I didn't do anything I could regret, but I thought more than I had in years. Thought about skin and hands and glances and the fact that I could still be watched. I thought about how easily a gaze could become a secret, and how a secret could become a need. The morning was louder than usual. Not with voices, but with movements, the scrape of a chair against tile, the clink of a fork against a plate, the uneven rhythm of someone pacing while drying their hair. He was up before both of us already. Dressed hair still damp from the shower, I heard the door of the fridge close, then the sound of a spoon stirring something in a glass. My husband had left for the hardware store routine Saturday errands, leaving just the two of us in the house. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was something else. Something far too controlled. I lingered in the bedroom longer than I normally would, standing in front of the wardrobe with a strange sense of ceremony. Not to impress. Not even to attract. But to test something myself. Him the boundary that hadn't yet been named. I chose a cotton dress, pale beige, cut just below the knee. Comfortable, familiar. Underneath, though, I put on the pale blue set again. The same one. That part wasn't for comfort. When I stepped into the kitchen, he didn't turn immediately. His back was to me as he rinsed a mug, the light coming through the window, caught on the edge of his jawline, his neck. I walked to the counter and began slicing an apple. The sound of the knife on the cutting board filled the space between us. When he turned to take a towel, our arms brushed, a small thing, a nothing, but not for me. He asked if I wanted to go out to the exhibition at the local art center. Might be less boring than another day in the garden. He said. I nodded. I told him I'd change, but I didn't. Not really. I only added a scarf soft and sheer, tied loosely around my neck. It made me feel intentional. We didn't speak much on the way there. The radio played something old and easy, and neither of us reached to change it. The exhibition was modest. A few oil paintings, some sculptures, a section of photographs from local artists. I wasn't particularly interested in any of it, but the air-conditioned stillness of the gallery gave me something I didn't know. I missed an excuse to be quiet and attentive, to not fill silence with household chatter. We stood in front of a statue, a smooth curved piece, a woman's torso abstracted into shape and shadow. He stood closer than necessary. Our arms didn't touch, but I could feel the heat of him. I shifted only slightly, and his head tilted toward mine. She looks like you, he said calmly. No trace of humor or flirtation, just a statement. I didn't respond. I don't even think I breathed. I just kept looking at the sculpture while my pulse roared in my ears. On the way back to the car, I kept my hands in my lap, fingers interlocked to stop them from shaking. My husband had sent a message. He'd be home late. A neighbor had invited him for coffee. I read it 3 times and still didn't know how I felt. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few scattered vehicles, some trees lining the edge, casting jagged shadows on the gravel. I opened the car door, placed my bag inside, then turned to him, meaning to say something. Anything but the words didn't come. He stepped closer. 1 step. Maybe 2. I didn't count. I didn't move away. I didn't make it easier, but I didn't make it harder either. His hand reached out, fingers brushing my scarf, then resting lightly on my shoulder. His eyes asked a question I didn't answer with words, just a small, unnoticeable nod, the kind you give when the thing you want terrifies you more than it should. The kiss wasn't long, not deep, not dramatic, but it was real. Real in the way a first sin is: quiet, deliberate, unforgettable. His mouth touched mine with care, like he knew something about me that hadn't been said aloud. When it ended, I didn't step back. I just looked at him. He didn't smile, neither did I. We drove home without speaking. The car felt smaller, the road shorter, my skin warmer. I could still feel the weight of his hand, the brief pressure of his lips. At home, he went straight to his room. I stood in the kitchen, hands pressed flat. To the counter, heart moving too fast for the room. I was in. Later, my husband came back with flowers. He gave them to me casually, with a kiss on the cheek and a list of updates about the neighbor's dog and the broken fence. I listened, nodded, arranged the flowers in a vase. My hands didn't tremble. I was calm. Too calm. That night, as I undressed, the blue lace slipped to the floor without resistance. I didn't pick it up. I left it where it fell, on the floor. In the dark. Still. warm from the day. The next day felt like a continuation of something I couldn't define. The air was thicker, charged with the silence between us, the quiet decisions we made without speaking. He was still there, moving around the house like he belonged. I moved through my day performing the routine tasks, making tea, preparing lunch, folding laundry, each action heavier than it had been the day before. It wasn't the work itself. It was the knowledge that there was something different in the house now. Something that wasn't going to disappear. I hadn't spoken to him since the gallery, but his presence lingered in everything, the way the sun hit the kitchen floor in the morning, the way the shadows stretched across the hallway. When I passed by, it wasn't a bad thing. In fact, I wasn't sure if it was a good thing, but it was undeniable. And for the first time in years, I felt myself alive again, my skin waking up to sensations I'd long since buried under the weight of daily life. When he walked into the kitchen, I didn't look at him immediately. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the coffee machine, the drip of water over the ground beans, the steam rising in the air. But I knew he was there. I felt the space between us, filling with something new, something unspoken but undeniable. He asked if I needed help with breakfast, a simple question. But the way he said it, the softness in his tone, made my stomach twist. I nodded, setting the plates down on the table. He moved closer, his presence a magnet, pulling me in a force I couldn't resist. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the toast. The touch was brief, yet it was enough to make everything inside me flare with awareness. His fingers lingered for a moment too long, not touching but hovering like the space between us was charged with electricity. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. We ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of knives on plates, the occasional sip of coffee. My husband came in after a while, his footsteps heavy, his voice loud in the quiet of the morning. He asked about the garden, something trivial, something that didn't matter. But I could feel my attention slipping, fading, as I realized that what I wanted, what was on my mind, had nothing to do with him. It wasn't about us anymore. It was about this new, uncharted territory that had opened up between me and the boy who was no longer a boy. Later, when my husband left for his errands, I stayed behind. I didn't know why, I just was. The house seemed quieter when he wasn't around, emptier in a way that was almost comforting. I walked past the guest room and saw him standing by the window, his back to me. The sight of him made my heart beat faster, but I didn't move. I didn't want to move. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open just a little further. I didn't think he'd hear me, but he did. His head turned slightly, just enough for his gaze to catch mine, but he didn't look away. The intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. There was nothing else in the world at that moment, just us. Just the space between us that was suddenly too small. Without a word, he turned back to the window, his expression unreadable. I stood there, my body tense with something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The silence between us was unbearable, and yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something held me in place. Something that wasn't physical but still bound me, kept me from walking away. I stepped into the room slowly, almost against my will. He didn't move, didn't speak. We just stood there, inches apart. The air between us, thick. With unspoken words, I could feel his presence like a heat radiating off his body, drawing me closer, pulling me into this space. I didn't know how to navigate. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the rapid thoughts spinning. In my mind, what was happening? Was this even real? Or was I dreaming, caught in some twisted version of reality that didn't make sense? He looked at me then, and for the first time I saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was something deeper, something raw. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, But no words came. I didn't need him to speak. I didn't need any words at all. I was already lost in the moment, lost in the weight of what was happening between us. Before I knew it, I was closer, so close that I could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of his skin, the subtle shift in the air as our breaths tangled. The moment stretched, and I realized I hadn't moved. Neither had he. And then, without thinking, my fingers reached up, brushing lightly against his arm, barely grazing the skin. It was a touch so soft, so fleeting that it felt like a confession in itself. I felt his muscles tense under my fingertips, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze dropped to my hand, then back up to my face, his expression unreadable. The tension between us swelled, the silence becoming unbearable. I could feel it. Then the pull. It wasn't just the touch, it was the promise of something else, something that was more than just a touch, more than just a glance. It was a question, a silent invitation. And for the first time in years, I didn't shy away from it. I didn't pull back. Instead, I stepped closer, my body, moving of its own accord, drawn to him like I couldn't resist. And for the first time, he didn't hesitate either. His lips were gentle when they met mine at first, as if testing the waters, but that gentleness quickly turned into something more urgent, something more desperate. It wasn't a kiss of love or even of affection. It was a kiss of need, of hunger, of something we both had been avoiding for too long. I felt his hands on my back, pulling me closer, his body pressing against mine, and I let myself feel it, all of it. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless. My body was alive with sensations I hadn't felt in years. I stood there, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. But I knew. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He was in the garden when I woke up, wearing an old t-shirt that clung to his shoulders and dampened with sweat near the collar. The sun was just climbing high enough to touch the tops of the hedges, and the scent of cut grass and warm soil filled the air. I stood on the veranda barefoot, holding a mug of coffee, watching him from behind the half-drawn curtain, like I didn't belong to the same world he moved with. The unconscious ease of someone who didn't know he was being observed, or maybe he did. And maybe that's what kept me standing there. My husband had driven into town earlier, something about the bank and the feed store. He hadn't kissed me. Goodbye. Hadn't done so in years, unless reminded I used to mind. Now I just noticed. Like a draft from an open window, annoying only when you stopped pretending not to feel it. I went back inside and changed. Not for any particular reason. Not in any calculated way. A cotton dress, light blue, a little too sheer, if you looked closely. No bra. I told myself it was because of the heat, because I was home. But I knew deep down, I knew. I stepped out into the backyard, walking slowly. Across the lawn, feeling the blades of grass press up between my toes. He was crouched over a bag of fertilizer near the greenhouse, his hands covered in soil. I asked if he needed water. He looked up. That look again. That pause. A second too. Long. Then a nod. He went inside to fetch 2 glasses and filled them, adding a few cubes of ice to mine. Even though I didn't care about the temperature, I handed him the glass. Our fingers touched briefly. Neither of us flinched. He sat down on the wooden bench near the edge of the flower bed. I stood a moment longer, then joined him. The air felt heavier near him. Charged, I took a sip of water and looked straight ahead. Not at him. He leaned back, forearms resting on his knees, and let out a low breath. We sat like that for several minutes, 2 people doing nothing, but my pulse wouldn't settle. A bee hovered between us and landed on his shoulder. He brushed it off with 2 fingers and then asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" The question cut through the heat like a blade. I didn't turn. I didn't answer. He didn't repeat it. He didn't have to. That evening I cooked dinner early. My husband was still gone. I moved through the kitchen, like a shadow barely aware of what my hands were doing. I chopped vegetables, simmered sauce, roasted chicken thighs with lemon and rosemary. I set the table for 3, lit a candle without thinking, then blew it out again when I realized what I was doing. I didn't want to explain the sudden romance of soft light and folded napkins. He came in from the garden, shirtless now, wiping sweat from his forehead with the hem. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine, warm and firm and deliberate. Later after dinner, I washed dishes in the sink while my husband read on the porch, and he disappeared upstairs. The plates were too clean already. I scrubbed them anyway just to keep my hands busy. My reflection in the window over the sink looked back at me, pale and tired and too awake all at once. That night I ran the bath longer than usual. The mirror fogged up before I even undressed. I let my dress fall to the floor and stepped into the tub, slowly feeling the heat wrap around my legs like hands. I sank down until the water lapped at my shoulders and closed my eyes. I imagined his hands, not the water's. The next morning, I passed his room on the way to the laundry. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, I caught a glimpse of his back bare and turned away from me. He stood near the window, looking out, unmoving. There was nothing indecent about it. And yet I felt like I'd walked in on something sacred. I stepped away quickly, quietly, but not before I knew he had seen me, at breakfast. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said. My husband read aloud some headline from the local paper and passed me the butter like nothing in the world had changed. Maybe for him it hadn't. Maybe it never would. But for me, everything had shifted. After the table was cleared, I went upstairs and opened the drawer where I kept the nicer things. I pulled out a bra I hadn't worn in months. White. Lacy, too delicate for everyday wear. I put it on under a clean dress, then layered it with a loose cardigan. I didn't know why. Or maybe I did. He was out by the shed again, hammering something, pretending he had a reason to make noise. I stood by the door for a while, watching him. Not just his body, though I was aware of it. Watching him, the way his brow furrowed, the way he paused to scratch his neck, the way he caught his breath when he noticed I was watching back. Nothing had happened between us since the kiss in the parking lot, but everything had changed. We were no longer strangers, no longer safe. We were standing on a line that blurred more each time our eyes met. A line I didn't want to erase, but didn't know how to. When I walked past him with the laundry basket, he didn't speak, but his gaze followed me like a tide pulling at the shore. Inside, I sat on the edge of the bed, breathing in slow, shallow bursts. The house around me was the same as it had always been, quiet, sunlit, full of harmless noise. But inside me, a storm was forming, not violent, not loud, just inevitable, and I was starting to want it to break. It started with a shirt. I found it at the edge of the laundry pile, still faintly, warm, damp at the collar. It smelled of sun and skin, of soil and movement. It wasn't a deliberate thing. At least, that's what I told myself when I lifted it with both hands and held it close to my face. Just a simple cotton shirt, gray, soft, creased at the sleeves. My fingers traced the fabric, slowly folding it with care that had nothing to do with tidiness. I set it aside from the others, not out of necessity, but because I couldn't put it in the same basket. That shirt no longer felt like just another item of clothing. It felt like evidence, like proof of a presence. I didn't know how to explain. It was nearly noon when he appeared in the doorway. I didn't hear him come up the stairs. His shadow stretched across the wooden floor before I saw him barefoot, wearing a different t-shirt now, but with the same careful expression he always wore around me lately. I was still holding the folded shirt. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. He stepped into the room, not with urgency, but with something that felt heavier, more aware. My hands froze. I wasn't embarrassed. I should have been, maybe. But all I could feel was heat rising in my chest, curling up my neck. He walked closer. Slowly. I didn't move. The space between us shrank with every breath. And then without asking, without hesitation, his hand reached out, not for my body, not for my face, but for the shirt I held. His fingers brushed mine as he took it gently from me and set it aside. On the edge of the bed, that gesture, simple, soft, deliberate, stripped the air between us of any doubt. His other hand rested on the side of my waist, barely there, like a question. I didn't answer it with words. I leaned in. The kiss came like exhale after holding your breath too long. Not rushed, not feverish, just undeniable. His lips were warm and tentative at first, almost reverent. Mine parted, not out of permission, but from the pressure building behind my ribs, that needed somewhere to escape. I wasn't thinking about consequences. I wasn't thinking about guilt or betrayal or anything outside that room. I was thinking about how his mouth felt against mine, how his hand slid around to the small of my back with a tenderness I hadn't tasted in years. Not possession, not hunger. Just this strange, terrifying reverence, like he was afraid I might vanish if he moved too fast. I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. Every part of me felt too alive to stop. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped the moment clean in half. I pulled back first. My breathing was shallow, my lips still parted. He stepped away without a word, and I turned toward the window, like I'd been checking the weather. My hands moved quickly, smoothing my skirt, brushing down my hair. I didn't know how long we had stood there. It felt like a blink. It felt like forever. My husband came through the front door with a bag of groceries and a pair of earrings. In a small velvet box, he handed them to me in the kitchen while unpacking lettuce and canned beans. They were on sale. He said, "Thought you might like something pretty." I opened the box. They were delicate pearl-colored drops on thin gold wires. Lovely. Tasteful. Completely wrong. I thanked him, kissed his cheek. He didn't notice how long I lingered before I placed the box on the counter and walked out of the room. The earrings sat untouched for the rest of the afternoon. I couldn't bring myself to put them on. They were cold, too cold for the skin. I'd just remembered was warm. Later after dinner, he napped on the couch with the remote still in his hand. I watched him sleep for a moment, not with anger, not even sadness, just with a kind of silent resignation. He was still the same man I married, still dependable, still kind. But something in him had long since gone quiet. And I had stopped trying to wake it. I went upstairs. I didn't turn on the lights. I passed the guest room. The door was closed. I stood there a second too long listening. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of a house that looked unchanged from the outside, while something deep within it had shifted beyond recognition. My bedroom. I undressed slowly, piece by piece, the pale blue lace slipping again to the floor. The mirror caught me in profile, and I paused. My body, aging, marked by years of repetition and care, felt unfamiliar in its reflection. Not in shame. In recognition, I saw the woman I had buried under obligation and politeness. She was breathing again. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the day in microscopic detail. His fingers, his breath, the weight of his eyes when they met mine. I felt each moment over and over, like pressing a bruise just to feel the ache. By morning, the shirt was still on the bed where he had placed it. I picked it up and pressed it to my chest. I wasn't sorry. Not yet. The following morning was overcast, the kind of dull gray that flattened everything it touched. The house felt quieter than usual, like it too was holding its breath. I moved through the kitchen slowly, methodically, wiping down countertops that didn't need cleaning and rearranging bowls that had already found their place. The noise of my husband's car pulling out of the driveway came like a signal, though I didn't flinch. He had a list of errands, mail, pharmacy, gas routine. Familiar safe. I lingered by the window, not for any reason I'd admit out loud. From this angle, I could see part of the backyard and the gravel path that led toward the shed. The bench by the hydrangeas still had the throw pillow. I'd left there last week, bleached slightly from the sun. He wasn't outside. Not yet. Instead, I heard the soft tread of footsteps on the stairs behind me, deliberate but not hurried. I didn't turn around. I kept wiping the already clean. Counter my fingers tense on the damp cloth. When I finally did turn, he was standing there in the doorway, barefoot again, hair still damp from a recent shower. His t-shirt was a plain, navy blue. I remembered that shirt. I remembered how it had looked crumpled at the edge of the bed 2 days ago. "I thought you'd gone," he said, voice low. I hadn't planned to. That was all we exchanged. Just that. I walked past him, slowly, brushing his shoulder lightly as I went. I didn't do it to provoke, I did it because I wanted to remember how it felt to touch someone and have it mean something. In the garage, I took the watering can off the hook and filled it. The plants near the fence had gone dry. As I walked outside, I saw him follow a few moments later. Not close, but not far either. I didn't look at him directly, but I felt him, watching me. Every motion bending slightly to reach the soil, tucking a lock of hair behind my ear, standing barefoot on the stones, was deliberate even if I pretended otherwise. When I finished, I turned and found him holding a set of car keys. "Do you want to get out of the house for a bit?" His voice was calm, not eager, not nervous, just steady. Like he knew I'd say yes. I nodded. We didn't say where we were going. We didn't need to. The drive was quiet. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his knee. I kept my eyes on the road ahead on the horizon that looked exactly the same in every direction. A few fields, power lines, the occasional lone tree. It didn't matter. I wasn't looking for scenery. After 20 minutes or so, he pulled into the gravel path of an old property on the edge of town. A friend of the family's empty for the summer. My husband had mentioned it once, something about needing to stop by and water the plants while the owners were traveling. He hadn't gotten around to it. We stepped inside, and the silence wrapped around us like a closed curtain. The house had that faint smell of disused dust and fabric, something floral and stale. There was a layer of fine pollen on the windowsills, and the furniture was covered in soft cloths, the corners tucked neatly. He didn't say anything. Neither did two. Ran my fingers over the piano keys in the front room. No sound. The lid was closed in the kitchen. Found a bottle of water in the fridge and poured 2 glasses. He leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching me. I handed him a glass, and our fingers brushed again, deliberate this time, meant. And still we didn't speak. We moved through. The space like dancers in an abandoned theater, every step practiced, but unspoken. We didn't kiss. Not this time. We didn't touch, not beyond the passing of the glass, but everything in the air between us burned hotter than contact when I stepped past him toward the hallway. His hand rose slightly, just enough to almost touch my arm. I felt the absence of that touch more than I would have felt the pressure of it. We moved through the house slowly, like tourists in a version of our own secret. In the back room, I found an old photo album and opened it on the coffee table. He sat beside me. We flipped through pages without looking at the images. My knee brushed his. I didn't move it away. After a while, I stood. He watched me walk to the window and lean against the frame. The air outside was warm but soft. The clouds having thinned into a hazy veil, I let my fingertips trace the edge of the glass, grounding myself. He stepped beside me. Neither of us looked at the other. We just stood there close without needing an excuse. Eventually, we drove home. There was no rush, no panic, just the heavy silence of something real, something we hadn't yet named. Back at the house, I unlocked the door and stepped. Inside, first. The normal sounds of life resumed: the fridge, humming, a bird outside, tapping at the windowsill. I turned to look at him, still standing in the doorway. He didn't step in right away. He held my gaze for just a second longer then. "Necessary, I'll be outside," he said, and disappeared down the porch steps. Upstairs, I pulled my cardigan off, slowly laid it across the back of the chair, and stood in front of the mirror. My lips still carried the memory of the kiss from days ago. My skin remembered the warmth of his nearness from the old house. I closed my eyes and let myself feel it fully, without apology. I was coming undone in the quietest, most deliberate way, and I didn't want to stop. The sun broke through. The clouds, the next morning, casting long, sharp shadows across the wooden floorboards of the kitchen. I stood barefoot in the corner, watching light slice between the curtains in thick golden lines. The silence in the house felt almost ceremonial. My husband had left early. A church friend had invited him to help fix a broken gate. He liked to feel useful. I said nothing, kissed his cheek, waved from the porch like any ordinary wife sending off her husband for the day, when the car disappeared. Down the road, I stood motionless for a long time, arms wrapped loosely around my waist. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel freedom either. I felt suspended, like something was about to give way, but hadn't yet. He appeared mid-morning, hair damp, wearing that same navy shirt from the day before. We didn't speak. There was no need. Our eyes met, and I could feel it between us again, that current low and steady threading the air. I went into the kitchen to prepare breakfast, something simple: eggs, toast, orange slices. I moved through the motions as if I were cooking for an ordinary morning for an ordinary guest, but I couldn't ignore the way my skin responded every time. He stepped behind me close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, the quiet weight of his gaze. We sat across from each other at the small wooden table. The space between us, narrow, insufficient. I buttered my toast with slow, deliberate strokes, pretending not to notice that his knee was angled slightly toward mine. He reached for the salt, and our fingers brushed again. Those accidental, rehearsed accidents we kept pretending didn't mean anything, but everything in me tightened, coiled like a spring. He spoke first. "I don't want to be here if it makes this harder for you." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Words felt too small, too imprecise. I looked down at my plate, then back up at him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gave him away, wide, tense, waiting. I finally spoke quietly, carefully. "It's not harder because you're here. It's harder because I don't want you to leave." The space between us collapsed. Not physically, we stayed where we were, but emotionally, the last sliver of pretense vanished like mist in sunlight. Neither of us smiled. There was no joy in the confession, only the raw truth of it, sharp and unadorned. After breakfast, we moved about the house like ordinary people. I did laundry, hung damp sheets across the line in the backyard. He cleaned out the garage, dragging boxes across the concrete with loud, deliberate effort. From the upstairs window, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept pausing, as if waiting for me to appear. When I finally stepped outside again, he was crouched over a toolbox, sorting nails and screws into neat fidgeting piles. I stood quietly by the porch railing for a while, watching him. The simplicity of the moment made it feel dangerous. Eventually, he looked up, squinting slightly in the light. "I'm not pretending this is nothing," he said. Neither was I. That night, my husband came home with takeout and a small bottle of white wine. He said he thought we could use a relaxed evening. I nodded, helped set the table, filled the glasses. I laughed at his jokes. I even touched his arm once when I passed him a napkin. I was a wife again, fully functional. But inside, I was somewhere else entirely. After dinner, he surprised me. He brought out a small jewelry box, long and slender, with that hesitant excitement in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. "I know it's not an anniversary or anything," he said, "but I saw these and thought of you." Inside were earrings, simple gold studs with a glint of green glass, not quite emerald. Pretty light, inoffensive. I smiled, even leaned forward to kiss his cheek. But when I excused myself to the bedroom and closed the door behind me, I didn't put them on. I left the box on the nightstand and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling with my arms crossed over my chest. Downstairs, I heard the clink of dishes, the hum of television. Life continued. In its regular rhythm, upstairs my heart beat to another. At midnight, I couldn't sleep. I stepped out onto the porch barefoot, the boards cool beneath my soles. The air was thick with summer, laced with honeysuckle and the scent of something. Burnt from a nearby chimney, I sat in the chair beside the potted rosemary, curling my legs underneath me, wrapping my arms tight around my ribs. He stepped out moments later, like he had been waiting just inside. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me in the other chair. Our shoulders closed, the silence full of everything neither of us could put into words. After a while he stood. I looked up, expecting him to go back inside. Instead, he handed me a folded piece of paper. Small, creased in half, nothing ornate. "I didn't know if I should give this to you." He walked away before I opened it. I unfolded it under the porch light. Just one line handwritten in steady, quiet letters. "If you come to the bus stop tomorrow at 9 mu, I'll be waiting." My hands trembled, but not from fear, from knowing for the first time in years that I had a choice. The morning came quieter than usual. I woke before the alarm, before the soft stirrings of the house began, and everything around me was still, as if even the air was holding its breath. I lay there on my back, staring at the ceiling, watching the curtain's shadow sway gently against the wall. Everything felt familiar, unchanged, yet no longer mine. I didn't get up right away. I stayed beneath the covers, listening to the cicadas outside, the way heat moved slowly across the floorboards, filling the house like a tide. Then slowly, I pushed the blanket off, letting the cool air run up my legs along my spine. My feet touched the floor. I'd already made the decision. The truth was, I had made it hours ago, sometime during the night when I held that note in my hand longer than I needed to, when I read the words again and again, like they were a map back to something I hadn't let myself feel in years. "If you come to the bus stop tomorrow at 9 source, I'll be waiting." Simple, honest. A question I could answer with presence. I washed my face in silence, water cool against skin that felt suddenly tender. In the mirror, the same woman looked back at me, same lines, same tiredness. But her expression had changed. Her eyes were quieter, her mouth no longer strained to smile. Her shoulders sat straighter, as though she were carrying something unspoken, but deeply hers. I dressed slowly, a soft, gray-green dress that clung gently to my body, outlining not curves, but memory. Underneath, I wore the lingerie I hadn't touched in years, not the blue one, a different set, one that made me feel human, not just seen. No makeup, hair pulled, back no adornment. I wanted to meet myself in honesty, no guilt, no disguise. By 8:23, I was in the kitchen. My husband was already outside in the shed. I could hear the dull clang of tools, the opening and closing of drawers. Everything sounded like routine, like a home functioning as it always had. I stood there in the center of the kitchen, unmoving. The silence wasn't unfamiliar. It was just full now. I brewed a single cup of coffee, placed it on the table, didn't drink it. I just watched the steam curl upward, vanishing into the air like a breath too shy to be heard. I didn't leave a note. No explanations, no poetry. Some things can only be understood through absence. I didn't walk fast. The bus stop was only 3 blocks away. I took my time. Not because I doubted, but because I wanted to feel every second of it. Every texture of sidewalk under my shoes, every shadow that passed over my face, every sound of life that I usually ignored. I noticed the missing. Tile in front of the old bakery, the man with the newspaper outside the barber shop, a child chasing a pebble with deliberate joy. When I reached the stop, it was 9:01. He was there. He wore a pale shirt, slightly wrinkled, his hair tousled like he hadn't tried to tame it. He had no luggage, no bag, just him. Our eyes met. Nothing else happened. No tears, no dramatic words, just a silence so full it became everything. I stopped a few feet away. We stood like that for a minute, maybe 2. He didn't say, "You came." I didn't ask, "Where would we go?" We just let the weight of choice settle into the cracks between us. He looked at me like he was waiting, not pressuring, just allowing, and that was the moment I knew I couldn't not. Because I was afraid. Not because I didn't want him, but because stepping onto that bus would have been a form of erasure. I would vanish into someone else's version of me, someone who didn't wrestle, who didn't stay when it hurt, who didn't choose stillness over escape. And I couldn't let that be the story, not mine. I nodded slowly. A silent thank you. For seeing me, for holding space, for not asking me to run. He understood. He didn't move toward me. He didn't beg. He just closed his hand slowly over the edge of his shirt, then looked away. The bus pulled up. He boarded. I didn't watch where he sat. I just watched the doors close. He didn't leave. The moment did. When I returned home, my husband was inside. The house. He asked where I'd been. I went for a walk. I said. He nodded. That was all. He didn't notice anything had changed, and somehow that hurt more than anything else. A week passed. Not quickly, not slowly, either. Time moved with the kind of weight that makes you notice its presence, not by what it brings, but by what it doesn't. Each day followed the last with mechanical precision. Coffee, sunlight through the same window, the sound of drawers opening newspapers, folding spoons, clinking against ceramic. My husband's footsteps across the floor, his voice when he asked what I wanted for dinner. My own voice always, even always measured, always saying something that didn't matter. Nothing happened, and yet everything had. He was gone. Not in a dramatic sense, no note, no message, no final knock on the door. The room was simply empty now. The bed made, the window closed, the echo of his weight on the staircase no longer part of my mornings. No mention of him from my husband. No questions. As if the absence of a young man in a house could vanish as effortlessly as the arrival of a breeze. But I noticed in how often I passed that guest room door and paused for no reason, in how my hands lingered. Over the laundry, half expecting to find one of his shirts folded between my husband's. In how, when I made dinner, I still portioned out enough for 3 before catching myself. Little ridiculous rituals that had become instinct before I had time to assign them meaning. The earrings were still in the box. I hadn't worn them, not once. My husband asked about them on Thursday. "Don't they go with that blue blouse you like?" he said. While tying up the garbage, I nodded, said, "I'd try them next week, maybe Sunday." He didn't push. He never did. That evening I took them out, turned them over in my hand. They were beautiful in a way, shiny, light, decorative. The kind of thing you wear to look finished, but that's all they were, finishings. I placed them on the table beside the mirror and left them there. They didn't belong to me, not anymore. Most nights, I sat on the front steps with a cup of tea. The chair beside me remained empty. I never brought a second cup, never pretended someone might join me. I didn't need to pretend. I just sat there in silence, wrapped in a sweater I hadn't worn in years, staring at the gravel drive, listening to the distant sounds of life continuing. I wasn't. Waiting. Not in the traditional sense. I didn't expect him to return. I didn't hope for a message. But a part of me, some hidden private part, replayed moments like film strips on loop. Not the kisses, not even the heat of the touches. But the silences, the unfinished glances, the questions asked with fingers instead of mouths. I had lived a version of myself during those weeks that I couldn't explain, not to anyone, not even to myself. A self that breathed differently, walked differently, slept with her back straighter, woke up feeling things instead of scanning for them. The old version had returned. The housewife, the provider. The quiet woman in the clean dress, but inside me that other self hadn't died. She had simply retreated. Folded neatly like the soft blue lingerie I no longer wore but hadn't thrown away. Once a few days after he left, I found the small note again, creased, softened at the folds from how often my fingers had pressed into it. I didn't cry. There was no place for tears in this story. Just breath. Just memory. I stood in front of the mirror that night in my nightgown, hair down bare feet on cool tile. I turned sideways, watching how the fabric moved with my body, how my body still moved. I didn't judge it. I didn't need to feel beautiful. I just needed to remember I existed. I lit a candle, not for romance, not for ritual, just for light. And in that flickering glow, I sat back on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my thighs, spine straight. I listened to the creaks of the house, to the wind outside, to my own breath. No one knew what had happened. Nothing had been said. Nothing had been discovered. To the world, I had been the same, but I knew I had crossed a line. Could never uncross. Not because of a kiss, not because of betrayal, but because I had allowed myself to want to feel, to remember. And even if I lived the rest of my life in this house, with its chipped mugs and unfinished conversations with the man who meant well but never really looked, I had changed. Not with noise, but with quiet, the kind of quiet that never leaves you.